I think before moving on, it would be nice if we could all give Alicia another round of applause. That was incredible. It is an honor to be here at Net Impact. It's an honor to share the stage with Alicia and the Black Lives Matter movement. Alicia talked about the arc of the universe, and she may have been referencing a quote, a famous quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And sometimes that quote can be misunderstood, that it bends on its own, like the horizon. But Dr. King said in other writings, and in his famous letter from Birmingham jail, that time is neutral. And the idea that we can wait for that arc to bend is false comfort. That change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, that bend only happens because people bend it. And that is why we're here today. That is the incredible work of Black Lives Matter and other social justice movements here in the United States and around the world. And Black Lives Matter, I so appreciate what Alicia said about Black Lives Matter not being the movement, but being part of a movement. And that the movements today are just part of and a continuation of, a manifestation of, an evolution of movements that have existed not just for decades, but for centuries. Again, in this country and around the world. Every one of those movements is a movement of real people. And what I so appreciate about what Alicia said is the way she said it. There is a fierceness and there is an incredible empathy that comes from her and how she's expressing what the Black Lives Movement is all about. And it's that empathy that creates connection. Alicia talked about at the root of all that is capitalism. That's an excellent segue to talk about the B Corp movement. She talked about one of the things we can do in public affairs is to increase transparency and accountability for our biggest institutions in whom we've understandably lost faith and trust. That's an excellent segue to this global movement of people wanting to use business as a force for good. But before we go to that, it's worth pointing out a couple characteristics of movements. And here are three of them, if you like alliteration. They are myriad, meaning it's not about Alicia or Patrice, or Opal, or Darnell. And just like it wasn't about Martin, or Ella, or Fanny, it's about everybody that's behind that. And this is no different. The movement of people using business as a force for good is about all of you and about all of the people that want to show up to work every day and bring their whole selves to work. It's not about any one type of company. It's not about any one type of organization. It's about all of us using the latent potential, the latent power of business for a higher purpose than just maximizing profit. The second thing is it's messy. Movements are messy. They don't go in one direction. They meander all around. They go 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, a couple to the side, but we fail forward as quickly as we can. So it's in that spirit that I stand here today, not as J. Coen Gilbert from B-Lab, but as a representative of this broad movement of people using business as a force for good to try to engage your thinking and your best thinking for how we can move forward together. This session, this morning's plenaries, were about how to invite you to ask the question, how can I make history? How can each of you individually make history? And that's a phenomenal question, because it frames it as a big opportunity. And there is a big opportunity, because in any crisis, there is huge opportunity, and we are faced now with a crisis, a civic crisis. But the framing is just a little bit off. And so if our friends from Net Impact will permit me, I'd like to offer this modest amendment to the framing, that it isn't about as Alicia said, it isn't about Black Lives Matter, and it isn't about B Corps. It's how will we make history together, because social change is a team sport. Nobody's going to come in and bend history alone. This is the biggest trend of our lifetimes. The evolution of capitalism. That's what's happening right now. The tectonic plates are moving under our feet. Sometimes they move so slowly that it's hard to feel it. But they can shake the earth and transform the landscape, nevertheless. What's happening is we're at the beginning of this change from one form of capitalism to another. One form of capitalism that manifested in the 20th century that was focused on maximizing shareholder value by any means necessary, towards a new conception of capitalism that is focused on maximizing value for all stakeholders. That is a fundamental mind shift in how we think about the very purpose of business. And that's the most important thing that's happening right now, because if we can harness the latent power of markets, the latent power of business, of capitalism, to a higher purpose than maximizing shareholder value, we can unleash one of the most powerful forces, man-made forces, human-made forces ever created, to create jobs with dignity and purpose, to restore the environment, to create pathways out of poverty, to reduce inequality. That's all within our path, because we have this incredible tool. We just need to recognize that we can use it to build a house and not just beat people over the head. But this kind of systems change, if you read the literature on the history of social movements in here and around the world, requires two things. It may require others as well, but it at least requires these two things. The first is there has to be widespread recognition of system failure. Check. If you didn't think that was the case after the BP spill, it's pretty evident after the global financial crisis in 2008 that there's an opening here, an energetic opening to recognize that the system isn't working. And as Alicia correctly identified, there's a populist movement around the world that is in response to the fact that there's a recognition that the system does not work, the economic system doesn't work. But that is insufficient. That is a cry, a plaintive crying to the wilderness that will not be answered. That is hope. And hope is not a good strategy for social change. The bending of history has to come from the creation of viable alternatives and making them visible and easier for people to take those steps. There's lots of ways that can happen. One way that's happening is through business, and one group of business leaders that are doing it are B corporations. The nonprofit that I run, called B Lab, serves this global movement of people using business as a force for good, and we try to make that alternative viable and scalable. And we do it through three things. We build a community of leaders that are visible and inspiring. They're called B Corps. We try to create tools that make it easier for millions of other businesses around the world to follow their lead. And then we try to inspire billions of people, ordinary people, to say, I can use my purchasing, I can make employment decisions or investment decisions to support businesses that are supporting communities, to support businesses that are supporting dignity here and around the world. There's now nearly 2,000 certified B Corps from over hundreds of different industries, over 50 countries around the world, all with that one shared vision of a better way to do business, where all companies compete not only to be best in the world, but to be best for the world. You might recognize some of the bigger consumer products companies. Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's. You heard from Chad from Etsy. Liz was correct. You heard from one B Corp last night. But again, I'd offer a modification. You heard from two. Mika from Sustain is also a certified B Corp. And as are many companies that you may not know about, from Kickstarter to the largest private enterprise in Afghanistan, Roshan. We're proud that Fast Company in their 20th anniversary issue said that B Corp, the advent of the B Corporation, is one of the 20 moments that mattered over the last 20 years. We're even more proud that Fortune, looking at big businesses, people with whom we've not had much engagement in the first 7 or 8 years of the B Corp movement, have said being like a B Corp is one of the key business trends to master in 2016. The important thing there is, and we love this, the idea is that we know not every company is going to be a certified B Corporation. That's a silly, arrogant, ridiculous vision. And what Fortune got right is that not everybody's going to be a B Corp. Standards are pretty darn high. Not everybody can get there. Not everybody chooses to get there. But everybody can be like a B Corp, and that's the trend. Because if you're a business manager, you want to be on trend. You want to attract and retain the best talent around the world, or the best long-term capital, then you better start thinking like a B Corp and acting like a B Corp. And that means two things. You need to align the interests of your business with the interests of society. And that we'll talk about the transparency and the accountability provisions around that. And the second thing is you've got to manage your business differently. You've got to manage your business so that you're managing your impact with as much rigor as your financials. There's a couple thousand B Corps. That's awesome. Some of them are incredible. There's 125 million businesses around the world. So the path to systemic change is not that everybody becomes a B Corp. The movement of people using business as a force for good is bigger than the B Corp movement. B Corps are leaders of that movement because they voluntarily meet higher standards of social and environmental performance, accountability, and transparency, which makes them worthy of our trust, but they are not the movement. The two things we do, the tools that we create to make it easier for other folks to follow their lead, we have tools of governance. There's a new type of corporation called the Benefit Corporation that's now available pretty much to any entrepreneur in the US. We've passed laws in over 30 states, importantly including Delaware, for all of you that are going to be starting or already in venture-backed businesses or businesses that are trying to access the capital market. In partnership with labor and others, we've advocated and successfully advocated for new regulations that govern ERISA, $6 or $7 trillion worth of institutional capital that can now flow into purpose-driven businesses that meet the highest standards of environmental, social, and governance. That's big systemic change that happens through the creation of a community of businesses that share a common vision, that have met standards that are worthy of people's support and admiration, and then work together collaboratively. Because social change is a team sport. In case anybody's wondering whether investors are investing in these businesses, here's just a few examples of very mainstream venture capitalists, private equity firms here and around the world that are already investing hundreds of millions of dollars in these companies. This is a path to attracting long-term capital that's focused on stakeholder value. And then there's also people managing their businesses differently. As Liz said, there's over 50,000 companies using the B Impact Assessment as a free educational tool to figure out how to take the next steps forward to measure and manage their impact with as much rigor as their profits. There's scores of gears-rated funds so that larger investors can find money to put to work in private equity around the world, where those companies' impact is being measured with comparable, credible metrics. Here are just some of the organizations with whom B Lab is partnering around the world that are using B Analytics, the data repository for all of that data, those 50,000 companies, those scores of funds, to help them better understand the impact of the businesses they're working with. Huge banks in South America, like Banco Colombia, the largest bank in Colombia, the third largest bank in Latin America. Large business networks like the B Team, Conscious Capitalism, and large institutional players like UBS and Prudential. All of these folks are gathering around the watering hole of a common set of standards so they can better implement a more empathetic, connected, relationship-based form of capitalism. And all that is incredible. But I am of two minds, decidedly two different minds about all of this progress and momentum. This is a cookie. It is not meant to reflect society. It's meant to represent how we are individually, often holding on to two different energy fields at the same time. Or at least, if you're anything like me, it certainly represents how I feel some of the time, often, and especially over the last 2 years, quite a lot. Because while we're all doing our individual businesses, we exist in the broader world. And this is what's going on in the broader world. And the election that Alicia spoke about is not just happening in the US, and that populist energy is not just happening in the US. It's manifesting in Brexit votes, and Brazilian impeachments, and peace deals in Colombia that are getting trashed, and nativist movements in Australia, and the rise of anti-Semitism and totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and leaders in Asia lifting up Adolf Hitler as he talks publicly as the president of a country about wanting to kill 3 million drug addicts. And so when that happens, my even split of managing my own energy spirals. And I can often end up in a pretty dark place. And I'm a privileged white male. And I end up here. I can barely imagine what it would feel like to be someone on the margins of that, to be someone without privilege, and have these forces arising up all around me. When I try to figure out how do we rise up out of, there's this huge rise of fear and insecurity around the world, and how do we get freedom from fear? And there's this incredible speech given by the Burmese, now Myanmar opposition leader, now government leader, Aung San Suu Kyi. And she delivered a speech in 1991 called Freedom from Fear when she returned from 15 years, or much longer, away from Burma after the assassination of her father, and became the opposition leader. And she said, the only thing more powerful than fear is courage. Where does courage come from? Courage comes from cultivating the habit of action. The moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, but it requires us to bend it. That requires action, and not just one action. The habit of action. That is hard to do, but that is the secret. There's one action that we can take, one thing that connects, a thread that connects Black Lives Matter, other social justice movements, with the B Corp movement and the broader movement of people using business force for good, is we need an inclusive economy. If you pull the thread on any of that energy, you get to an economic system that people feel excluded from. So how do we change that economic system? It's true that capitalism could not have existed could not have developed as it did without slavery. That's a fact. That doesn't mean that capitalism or capitalists are inherently evil. It means that we have misused a very powerful system. We need to create an inclusive economy to achieve our collective vision of a more shared and durable prosperity. And if we all seek to be credible leaders of a global movement of people using business force for good, we have to take meaningful action on inclusion to create an economy. Sure. We have to create an inclusive economy that creates opportunity from all, regardless of what their identity is or where they were born, and that creates a life with dignity. We did this with the B Corp community, where we issued for the first time an inclusion challenge, asking all B Corps to pick 3 things, where they're going to make concrete, measurable progress to take 3 steps to create more inclusive business as a next step towards creating an inclusive economy. Examples: restaurants that are paying all their workers a living wage. Companies like Etsy that are creating jobs for people with different abilities. And huge importers of fair trade organic coffee that are going beyond fair trade supply chains to creating worker ownership. Those are all different aspects of inclusion. And it brings me to my final thought, which is all of those things may feel small. But it's the small things when put together that make a big difference. An incredible speech that Robert F. Kennedy gave in South Africa in '66, called the Ripple Speech, recognized that few of us have the greatness to bend history on our own. But each individual action of courage and hope sends forth a ripple. And when all those ripples join together, they can build a current. In '66 South Africa, it was a current that could topple the walls of the mightiest oppression. And in 2016, it's the ripples that can transform one of the mightiest systems of exclusion, which is the current practice of shareholder capitalism. We can transform that with all of our ripples to create a more inclusive economy, to create a capitalism that works for all, a stakeholder capitalism. The future is not something that happens to us. It's not some place we're going to, but one that is being created, first in our mind and next in will, and then as Aung San Suu Kyi said, and this professor from UC Santa Cruz affirms, next in activity, in our action. If we don't take action, nothing will happen. The universe doesn't bend on itself. So let's make some ripples. Let's make history. Thank you very much.